Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. Sorry for the technical difficulties here. I'm Jen Wiley. I'm the Young Animal Nutrition Sales Leader for Cargill, and we're super excited to sponsor Dr. Dale R. Werner serves as the Cargill Endowed Professor at Sustainable Meat Sciences in the Department of Animal and Food Sciences at Texas Tech University. He served on the faculty of Colorado State University for 9 years before stepping into his current position at Texas Tech University in 2018. He has conducted more than $15 million in industry-funded research and has published more than 300 scholarly works, including peer-reviewed manuscripts and technical reports on meat science. His team has worked extensively with the beef on dairy segment for the past 5 years, focusing on carcass and beef quality. Today's training has been accredited by the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists and Dairy Advance for up to 1 CE credit for those interested in that. And so at this time, I would like to ask everyone to please silence their phones and give Dr. Werner your full attention. The stage is yours.
Good afternoon. All right, the microphone's working. That's always a positive. I didn't know I was going to be teaching class again today, so that's good that you're getting credit for being here. We always like to check those boxes for you. So a quick question. I like to be interactive. Hopefully you guys are storing up some questions for the end of the session. That's probably going to be the best part today, so please engage in that. But my first question for you is, how many of you are dairy producers? Okay, maybe not as many as I thought. Maybe I thought the whole room would be. So those of you that raised your hand that said you were dairy producers, how many of you are beef producers? Same people should raise their hand, right? So the idea is even though we've really gotten into a position where we're talking a lot about beef on dairy or crossbreds, the reality is dairymen have been beef producers all along, right? So producing a significant amount of beef by the way of cull cows, by the way of offspring, whether those are bull calves or heifer calves, into this market, and so you've very much been a part of this business for quite some time. However, it's changed just a little bit here in most recent years, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm a meat scientist, not a dairy scientist. I'm learning just as much or more about dairy as you are potentially about beef, particularly in the last 5 years or so. So if we take a look at the number of fed cattle that we harvest each year for beef in the United States, and these fed cattle are steers and heifers that are generally less than 24 months of age, fed through feedlots. There's about 25.5 million of those year over year. Traditionally, we've seen about 5 million of those coming into our market as purebred Holsteins or purebred dairy animals, okay? And this 5.1 million is reflective of pre-2018. Since 2018, we've seen a major shift in our industry with these crossbreds, right? Now, crossbreds have been a part of our market for decade upon decade, but they've always come in disguised. In fact, that was the intention, right? For those that were producing half-blood Angus, half-blood Holstein, or Jersey Limousine crosses, the whole intention was to get those into feedlots, disguise them as conventional cattle, and push them through the system to get premiums on a carcass basis and ultimately make money, okay? Well, today we don't know exactly how many of these animals are coming through as crossbreds, but we're pretty confident that it's over 3.25 to 3.5 million head of, let's say, that potential 5 million head that we've traditionally seen. Now, if we take a look at the proportion of these cattle coming into the fed beef market, that proportion has actually grown quite a lot in the last couple years. So traditionally, we'd say it's about 18 to 20% of the fed beef market. Today, we would say it's over 20%, maybe up to 23% of the total number of fed steers and heifers are actually coming from dairies. Now, the reason from that is the beef cow herd has shrunk quite significantly over the last 2 or 3 years. Why has it shrunk? Was it a voluntary thing? Absolutely not. The idea is that it's shrunk as a result of widespread drought, specifically in the Midwest and Southwest regions of the United States, where we've removed a lot of the beef cow herd by culling those as a result of a lack of feed, a lack of rainfall in those environments. So this segment, the dairy segment in the beef industry, has really only grown in significance in the last few years, even more so than it traditionally has. So it's perfect timing, perfect storm, if you will. This is why you're seeing the exceptionally high values in day-old calves. I don't want to share a whole lot of dollar numbers because I don't want to upset anybody or overexcite someone, but these calves are worth a tremendous amount of money as day olds today, and it ranges to quite high values. And this is the case for all beef cattle coming into the market as well. So why do we focus on the last 5 years? Well, really we should focus on the last 6 years or maybe even 7 years. Because the idea is that in 2016, Tyson Foods, one of the largest meat packers in the United States, decided to no longer accept Holstein steers into their establishments for harvest. So they made a blanket statement that we're no longer going to procure and process Holstein steers. As a result of essentially a third of the market falling out for those calves, supply grew, demand diminished, and price got really cheap, to the point where you really couldn't even give away these Holstein bull calves at some point in time. We're talking a $20, $25, maybe $50 value. Now we're 10x or more of that today coming into the market. So when Tyson Foods, a third of the packer market, decided to quit taking these calves, it changed the game. Luckily, as dairymen, you're quick to adapt. You're using artificial insemination almost exclusively in your operations. And we quickly saw a change in the amount of beef semen being sold into dairies. And simultaneous to that, we saw a decline in the amount of dairy semen being sold into dairies. So a very obvious trend in 2017 in that we are starting to breed more cows to beef bulls. And today we've shown you we're about 3.5 million head, we believe, of that 5 million. So there are still some purebred Holsteins, some crossbred Holstein jerseys coming into the market, but they are now the minority in this market share. So we know we've seen a lot of pickup and adaptation in order to these market trends. The rest of the time here we're going to talk about some of the research that we've done. We've had multiple supporters in these research efforts, probably too many to list in complete. One of these guys is sitting right out there. There's Max, sitting about midway through. Great partnerships with genetics companies like ABS, specifically a Feedlot in Kansas, Cargill letting us into their plants. And we really couldn't have done any of it without support from the beef checkoff, which you pay, by the way, as dairy producers producing cattle. So every time that you transact a dairy cow or a fed animal or a day old, you're paying that $1 beef checkoff on a mandatory basis. So hopefully this is coming around to help you some as well. We'll take a quick overlook at the differences physiologically, biologically in these cattle types. There are some things that we know are just different about them. To think that, yes, they're bovine, but to think that they're the same is an incorrect statement, right? These animals have been bred specifically, not only by breed, but within those breeds very specifically in genetic trait selections over generations to be very different animals. Conventional beef cattle, we'll use Angus as the stereotypical example here in this discussion, in general have quicker growth rates, right? These animals are built for performance. They have overall better gut health, and this is specific to the discussion of liver abscesses in the sense that metabolically they're better to their gut, they're better to their liver, and the liver doesn't enter that disease state near as often as it does in the dairy cattle. Dressing percentages are higher. This means that their carcasses are heavier relative to their live weight. Okay, so they produce heavier carcasses as a result of having more muscle in comparison to bone. They have a more desirable steak shape, so when you get a ribeye steak or a strip steak, they're rounder and more symmetrical. And they have improved lean color, a lean color that's brighter and more cherry red. If you can think about a maraschino cherry, this is something that we would look for ideally in beef, and the conventional beef animals have that to their advantage. We'll talk more about that later. On the flip side of that, in a positive sense, dairy cattle provide genetic consistency. We know that the genetic composition of these animals is much narrower, primarily because of AI and the extensive use of high-performing bulls and keeping those same replacement heifers. Biologically, they have a more oxidative fiber type. Their cellular structure is different. They metabolize feed different. They take the energy that they consume and they put it into milk. They put it into milk components, which is very different than putting it onto the carcass itself. These things, like the oxidative fiber type, lend itself to the next several sets of things on the list. These cattle have more marbling on average than conventional cattle. They are leaner on the outside of their body. They put the fat inside the milk, they put the fat inside the muscle, not on the outside. They're also more tender because their cells are smaller, their fiber diameters are smaller, and our research shows that they produce more flavorful product as a result of some of these biological differences. So the question really becomes, in this dynamic of conventional cattle and straight-bred dairy cattle, predominantly Holsteins in our discussion, where do these crossbreds fit? And that's really where our research started. Where do they go into the market? How can we market and sell them to the consumer? Because that's ultimately what matters. One of the first questions that we decided we needed to answer was a result of listening to dairymen early on. So this is, again, 5+ years ago, but one of the concerns that we would hear just in conversation is, if I do make a wholesale shift and I start breeding my cows to beef bulls, can I expect that the lactation performance is going to change? Now, we sat there and said, gosh, it really shouldn't. But evidently there was some discussion out there that it may have changed on occasion. So we went back in, we partnered with some really large dairies in the Midwest, had multiple dairies represented in our Dairy Comp 305 data, and we looked at that retrospectively over a 4-year period to understand whether or not breeding to a beef-type bull instead of a Holstein or purebred dairy bull would matter. What we ended up finding is that those bred to beef bulls were in gestation or had a calf 1 to 2 days longer. So they had a longer pregnancy. So technically it was taking 1 to 2 days out of milk productivity as a result of breeding to that beef bull. However, when we take a look at the overall lactation performance as recorded by these large dairies, including dairies that bred cows in 1 year to a dairy bull, the next year to a beef bull, and then crossed back over to a dairy bull. So we have really good comparisons in our data. We feel really good about how the bulls are crossed over in about 12,500 cows in this particular study. And ultimately what we came up with is there was no difference in lactation performance as a result of breeding to a beef bull, or vice versa, breeding back to a dairy bull. So we're very, very confident that we do not see a reduced lactation performance as a result of switching over to beef on dairy, which was good news for us. Now, perhaps a little bit more out of your realm as dairymen and women, we're starting to look at the feedlot performance here. Again, partnering with the feedlot specifically in Kansas, who had traditionally fed Holsteins, was one of the earliest feeders of crossbreds, and then of course fed conventional cattle. We started to do some closeout comparisons with those cattle, and we realized that because this feedlot was taking in heavier cattle to start, so about 900-pound calves coming out of the calf ranch or calf nursery stage, these cattle were similar days on feed, a little bit longer with the beef on dairy crossbreds there. But ultimately what we were most interested in was the performance data. And we began to understand that there was an average daily gain difference between these cattle at 3.5 pounds gain per day versus 3.3 in the crossbreds, but something very similar. These cattle are comparable to the conventional cattle, which is very favorable news. Feed to gain very much in the advantage of the native cattle, but again in the ballpark, right? So the idea is are they comparable? I think our results say yes, they're comparable even though they are slightly different. And tremendously different from the traditional Holstein. And that's the real glass half full takeaway from this message, is even though they're not quite as good as the conventional beef cattle in this comparison, they're far better than the traditional Holstein in terms of feed conversion and efficiency of gain. So we've really gained some positive traction here in creating these crossbreds. In this particular study, we found that dressing percentage was about a point or 1 percentage back for the crossbreds, meaning the carcasses were lighter. What we'll later find out is that carcasses being lighter or having a lower dressing percentage isn't always a bad thing, because in this case, it simply meant that those cattle were trimmer, they were leaner, and as a result, they're actually higher yielding. So we chase dressing percentage as if it's the most important thing. But in reality, if dressing percentage gets excessively high, It's not for the positive. And so that's something that we've taken away from this as well. Quality grade performance, we'll show you more data on that later, but these cattle certainly grade as well, and most of the time better than conventional cattle. Something else of note is these data are about 4.5 years old now, and the genetics that are being placed into the beef on dairy scenario have gotten so much better that I can confidently say that these data are not only approaching sameness with conventional cattle, but in many cases probably have become very, very close to the same, and in some cases even better because of the genetic improvement. So these data outdate themselves really quickly in a time frame like this. When we take a look at improvements in feed to gain ratio and average daily gains, it doesn't take us very long to figure out that these animals are more efficient than are the traditional Holsteins. And in fact, they're about 30% more efficient in converting feed, and primarily because they are on feed a fewer number of days. So when we subtract those number of days out of the Holstein cattle with the crossbreds, then we start to see very significant savings in CO2 equivalents. So now we get into this carbon credit discussion, which makes these very carbon responsible cattle, which of course adds value to them as well. And that is, at least in part, the attraction of packers and feeders to these crossbred cattle. If we take a look at carcass performance, and I apologize, there's a lot of black and white here. We'll get to some more colorful pictures here in a second. But the idea is, on a carcass basis, these cattle perform dead in the middle between Holsteins and traditional conventional cattle, in that they're about half as fat, or they're intermediate in how fat they are. So the Holsteins are the leanest. The Angus cattle, for comparison's sake, are the fattest, and these cattle are in the middle. The same is true for ribeye area or indications of muscling, where again these cattle are intermediate. The one thing that does stay constant with the dairy influenced cattle is they have more internal fat. Whether they're crossbreds or whether they are purebreds, they have more internal fat inside their body cavity, but they also have more internal fat in their muscle, which is desirable because we like that marbling within the muscle for eating qualities. They're intermediate in their yield grade performance, which transitions us to this slide, which is that we actually improve the distribution of yield grade in these cattle. Now, if you're not familiar, yield grade is used to value carcasses. And so the lower the number of yield grade, it ranges from 1 to 5. So a 1 is a superior yield grade, meaning that that animal has more muscle and less fat and less bone. Okay? 5 is the opposite, very fat, a high proportion of bone, low proportion of muscle. These cattle, crossbreds, actually shift in a favorable direction and actually have more favorable yield grades than do conventional cattle. This is predominantly because they have less fat. Fat is a big part of this equation, and we've also increased ribeye area, the size of the muscle, enough to improve yield grade performance. So we see an improvement in the crossbreds over that of traditional Holsteins, and even that to the advantage of the conventional beef. Now here's the other part of the equation, and that's quality grade. For simplicity's sake, quality grade equals marbling. So the amount of marbling within a ribeye steak or the amount of marbling within a strip loin steak adds to eating quality. And we measure the amount of marbling to determine what the eating characteristics are of those carcasses. And this is the leading contributor to the per pound value of carcasses. Now, the leading contributor to the value of a carcass is weight. Okay, but the per pound value is influenced mostly by quality grade. So this is a really positive thing when it improves. Now we've known this for a long time, but Holsteins traditionally have had the most marbling in comparison to all other cattle types. In fact, as much as half, if not more than half, of the prime steaks in the United States have actually traditionally come from Holsteins. Now we've subtracted Holsteins out of the equation and replaced them with crossbreds. Luckily, these crossbreds also have more marbling than conventional cattle, and they still are producing very high proportions of prime. But we've actually seen a dip in prime across all cattle in the United States because we've removed Holsteins from the equation. Okay, so the one negative thing from quality grade performance with crossbreds is we've pulled those really high quality Holsteins out of the equation, but it's kind of like meeting in the middle. These cattle still have a lot of marbling. In fact, on average, they have more marbling than conventional cattle, many of them qualifying for branded programs like Certified Angus Beef and others that I could mention, right? So these cattle do qualify based on phenotype into those programs and level of marbling. So very, very high quality beef. So when we think about what we're eating in general, we're talking about the palatability of beef, and we're talking about tenderness, juiciness, and flavor in this triangular fashion. And we have pursued greater eating quality for some time in our industry, and we evaluate that by actually tasting or eating the product and asking panelists, which in this case are graduate students, to rate those products on individual attributes like tenderness, juiciness, flavor, and a whole bunch of different specific flavor notes, okay? Through those trained sensory evaluations, we've learned that anything dairy influenced actually has a more desirable tenderness score than conventional cattle. So what am I telling you? Whether they're purebred Holsteins or crossbreds, they're more tender on average, okay? What I'm also telling you is they have a more desirable fat-like and buttery fat-like flavor profile. Is it ironic that dairy cattle have a more buttery flavor profile? Yeah, it's probably not much irony. It's actually by design. These cattle are imposing or imparting a different composition of fat, which gives it a creamier, more dairy-like flavor to the beef, which of course is desirable. Who doesn't like butter? If you don't like butter, don't raise your hand, because you'll probably get tomahawked in here. So here we go. So let's talk about these types, right? So obviously we've seen Angus leading in this space because we want black-hided cattle. We've seen other successful breed types, including Charolais, which are not black. We've seen Simmental Angus crosses, Limousin Angus crosses, all entering this market. But the idea is that each of those breeds in many ways provides complementarity to the Holstein breed. Here's the latest trend in the market, however, and that's breeding these dairy cows to Wagyus, right? So the idea is this Wagyu market is niche, but it's growing very significantly and very rapidly. So we've started to look at some of this population as well, and understanding that anything bred to Wagyu, of course, is superior over that of conventional cattle, even in the prime grade. And then to make it even better, we cover it up with a Holstein cow. So a Holstein Wagyu cross is the highest performing eating quality steaks that we've tried in our laboratory. So the combination of those dairy genetics and Wagyu genetics is like the creme de la creme. And the idea is that they outperform in tenderness, they outperform in all of the sensory attributes that are positive. Okay, so it's still a very small percentage, still a very much niche market, but there's a lot of synergy there. And we want to make the best beef that we can make in a cross-mating scenario in the United States. Then we cross a dairy cow with a Wagyu, Japanese Wagyu bull. So I told you earlier we would get back to this discussion on color. Traditionally, when we sold Holstein products, steaks, in a retail supermarket, we had to separate them. In fact, it was to the point where a supermarket would only buy Holstein, or a supermarket would only buy conventional beef, because they learned if they put them together, the conventional beef would sell twice as fast than the Holstein beef. And the leading reason was the color. The Holstein beef product was darker in color, and when in comparison to conventional beef, they wouldn't pick the Holstein up. And on top of that, the Holstein not only was darker color to start, but it faded more rapidly, and it turned brown or oxidized more rapidly. The best news of all of our research is here in this slide, because once we started employing these crossbreds into our market, this problem essentially went away. For whatever reason, the crossbreds perform almost identical to conventional beef in color performance as well as color stayability. And so now we can commingle all of the beef. There's no longer a logistical nightmare of shipping Holstein to California and to Ohio to be sold in 2 very large retail stores or Costco. only. Now we can blend all of that beef together and sell it universally across the board. It's a change in actually the metabolic fiber type. So it's a physiological change in at the cellular level is the best explanation we have. And that's not a complete explanation, but it is the main explanation we have at this point. So it's a genetic combination and then also a response to feeding. So, but very, very good news. There's a sustainability message tied up in that as well, okay? Here was the second leading question here. In selling dairy products, so these would be traditional purebred Holstein steaks, you can see a much narrower steak. It's not as symmetrical, it's not as round on average, right? And in some cases, they would actually become very sharp on the end and undesirable in their look. Now that we have the crossbreds in comparison to native beef, you can see that they perform very, very similar to one another. And this too is something we no longer worry about. Again, this was another reason why we had to separate out Holsteins, because nobody wanted to buy the skinny little strip steak. Everybody wanted to buy the big round strip steak, right, for the family. Now that we've neutralized that effect within these cattle, we can sell them together and confidently say they're going to move off the shelf at an equal or even greater pace if they have more marbling, okay? So when we got into year 2 or 3, this is where Dr. Garrison really got involved with our research. We started to, take the obvious observation here that when you went into a feedlot, if you're a livestock person, the first thing you would say is, wow, those are really good, and wow, those are really bad. Like, what are we talking about? Well, the phenotypic expression of something that looks really good in a beef person's mind is something like the steer on the top, right? Very muscular, very conforming in terms of overall carcass composition versus one on the bottom that we would associate with being very bad. What it really got down to is we started saying those are really beef type and these look really dairy type. Here's the crazy part. These two steers were born 5 days apart, okay? They're actually from the same dairy. They were raised in the same calf ranch and went in the feedlot at the same time. And they were fed through that feedlot through the same feeding period, same ration. So this is a genetic difference, right? The combination of genetics from the cow and the bull came into play here. And so these are contemporary animals that really couldn't look more different. As a result, these are their actual carcasses. On the left is the steer on the top, and the carcass on the right is the steer on the bottom. So this is something we became very intrigued about and started to study more closely. Our original question was, did those two things eat differently? In other words, did the dairy animal or dairy-looking animal eat better than the more beef-looking animal? Our data say no, right? They eat the same. We actually couldn't find a difference in the eating characteristics of the steer on the far left versus the steer on the far right. That was really good news, because for us what that means is make them better. This is my message to you. There's an opportunity today to make these crossbreds better by choosing better genetics to start into this equation, right? Better bulls, more conforming bulls, more complementary bulls, which means shorter statured, wider made, heavier muscled bulls, fit better when you're breeding them to a very tall, very narrow dairy cow, right? So we need some complementarity in that. And when we make them better, the eating quality really doesn't change. So why not make them better? The rest of this research that I'm going to talk about compares these 4 groups to one another. So we segregated about 940 head of cattle into these 4 phenotypes, okay? So we have equal representations of cattle that appear to look like these examples in these pictures, and we began to compare them. The idea is through all stages of development, these cattle actually did not differ in weight. So whether they looked like this or whether they looked like that, on average, they weighed the same at the same time. So this tells us that the weight or the total mass didn't change, but the way they appeared and the composition changed. So in theory, the ones on the top had more bone relative to their weight. The ones on the bottom had more muscle and fat in association with that same weight over time, okay? One of the most profound things that we discovered is that steer on the left and steer on the right. By the way, this is the same steers going through the whole picture discussion here. They have the same ribeye area on average. So the indicator of muscling that we use to value carcasses did not change within the group, okay? This is a little bit disturbing because that's the area measurement we use to pay you on. And regardless of whether they look like the steer on the right or the left, we were basically paying you the same, okay? However, we know very well that round muscling score, right, which is the hind end of that animal, changed or was very much different, which in this case is a much better indication of total carcass muscling, to the point where we look at round muscling score, the hind end muscling score is correlated with true muscling score at about 0.5, versus the ribeye area correlated at only 0.22, explaining less than 12% of the total variation in the population. So ribeye area, candidly, in short, is just not good. It's not a good indicator of true muscling in these carcasses. So in order to understand the true value difference, we did a comparison between the two steers that I've been showing you, and then also comparing those to conventional beef and traditional Holsteins. So we have conventional beef, we have Holsteins, we have the low-yielding phenotype and the high-yielding phenotype, and we compared them in an in-plant trial. So we took these into a packing facility owned and operated by Cargill in cooperation with them with this research, and we took that carcass and we broke it down into its parts, and for example, the loin was then broken down into the saleable parts. So what you see there is tenderloin, sirloin, strip loin, sirloin flap, and tri-tip. Any Californians in here tri-tip eaters? Nobody at all? All right, I knew there were a few quiet ones in here. All right, the idea is that tri-tip is part of that loin mix. What we did is summed all of those weights together as closely trimmed saleable subprimals and compared that to trimmings, fat, and bone in these carcasses to understand what the proportional differences were in these cattle. What we found is anything that was either a straight bred dairy or looked more like a dairy, in actuality did have more bone. So this helps us to explain the heavier weights in those lighter muscled cattle, explaining that they had a higher proportion of bone. The lower phenotype, so the narrow steer, is next to the Holstein. The higher phenotype steer that's also a crossbred is one step up from that. And the conventional beef cattle had the least amount of bone of any in this comparison. Now this is the amount of subprimal. So this is the tenderloin, the strip loin, and the sirloin, all summed into one. What you'll see is the Holstein is the low performer. The low phenotype is the second lowest performer, and then, like what changed? All of a sudden this high phenotype crossbred actually performs as good or better in actuality than do conventional beef. So what this again demonstrates is if we make these cattle good, they will in fact perform as well or better than conventional beef. Now don't go back to somebody and tell them I said that all beef on dairy crosses perform better than conventional beef, because they don't, right? If we take the average of these two dairy phenotypes and put them together, they actually perform on this line. So on average, they perform less than conventional beef. But the really good ones can actually outperform the average conventional beef calves. And that's the message in here, and an incentive to make you guys think about making them better through better genetic selections on the dairy farm. Yep. Yes, so this is the high yielding. So this is the good looking beef steer in the pictures. And this is the low yielding. So that's the skinny dairy looking steer in the pictures. And there were about 28 of those in each of those groups. So it wasn't just that one steer. This was a representation of that whole group. I didn't go through all of the experimental design, but those 28 is a relatively low number, but they are distributed from bookend to bookend within that group to represent that group really well. Okay, so we did take that into account. Good question. The idea here is that these crossbred cattle are far more valuable than traditional Holsteins. On average, they're not quite as valuable as the conventional cattle on a cutout or yield basis, but those that are high yielding are as good as, if not better, economically and product-wise to conventional cattle. Okay, so I'm gonna call a timeout here for a reality check. Because everything I've told you up to this point says that, my gosh, these cattle are better than conventional cattle, and in many ways they are. eating quality, right? Tenderness, flavor, performance, even yield grade and quality grade. It seems like, man, what is this guy telling me here? Why aren't we paying more for these crossbred cattle? Well, we took a little preview of that, taking a look at the yield data. They are set back somewhat on red meat yield performance. But the primary reason today, and the primary reason moving forward until we get this problem fixed for the discount in these cattle is liver abscesses, okay? Now you think the liver, wow, the liver, I don't even eat liver. What could that possibly be worth? Well, the answer is the liver is worth $5 to $10 based on the size of the animal and the size of the liver. So it's not all that valuable. But when the liver is abscessed, it's condemned, right? So we lose $8, let's say, on a liver itself. The biggest issue with the liver is not the $8 per head that we lost, but if that liver, in fact, is severe enough to attach to the diaphragm or attach to the abdominal wall, then we lose the diaphragm, which is the beef skirt steak. It's worth about $60 a head if we take both diaphragms out of the same animal. The abdominal wall is that sirloin bavette. There's probably another $25 or $30 a head tied into that. So we have product losses associated with that that could easily equate up to $100 a head when these liver abscesses occur, specifically when they are in a severe state, okay? Now, not all of them are in a severe state, but about 20% of them are, okay? So 1 out of every 5 actually can have up to $100 in product loss. The bigger issue is that when 1 out of every 5 carcasses comes down the line, requires additional trimming by the meat cutters in the plant, it stacks up and it actually stops the productivity in the plant. It's generally accepted that the cost of production per minute in a plant is somewhere between $1,700 and $2,000 a minute. So every time we stop the plant's production, we're costing $1,700, $2,000 a minute, which essentially subtracts that animal out of the plant in terms of value. So it's like the animal didn't even exist, right? Because we've lost all of the money by having to trim and slow down the production speed. All of that to say that this is a major issue. This is an issue that's causing product losses, efficiency losses, dollar losses, and as a result, the beef industry is employing per head discounts on all of these cattle, because early on in this, on average, we were probably 60 to 75% abscessed as a group. So 60 to 70% of these crossbred animals actually had liver abscess, and 20 to 25% of those required severe trimming to the carcass and railing out and stopping the production speed. Now, I will say today this number has improved quite a lot, probably because of improvements in genetics, but also improvements in production practices. I think it's fair to say that those started feeding these crossbreds early just didn't know what they were doing. They were feeding them just like conventional cattle. Since then, they have learned that they need to be fed a little bit different, and so we've improved some. Perhaps we've backed off to 50% on average overall liver abscesses. But I will tell you that some feedlots have gotten below 20. So there are very evident changes in production management that can, in fact, improve this to a point where maybe they don't receive the discount any longer. And here's the last thing I'll say relative to these liver abscesses. When the conventional beef numbers return, because they will, eventually it will rain, eventually we will rebuild our cattle herd. Maybe it'll take as long as 2027, 2028, but they'll come back. When they come back, if this problem is persisting, then general managers of beef processing plants and beef packers as a whole will push these to the curb and they'll stop paying for them. And so we'll see the same issue that we saw in 2016 and 2017 if we don't fix this problem. Otherwise, these cattle are a premium product. Not only are they higher yielding in some cases, but they're more efficient. There's a carbon message tied to them. So there's an environmental sustainability message. We're producing high quality beef with positive yield and quality grades. The product going out into the retail and food service marketplace is not only good, but it's better than most of the beef that we're producing. Ultimately, it's very consistent because of the genetic consistency and traceable. This is something that truly sets the dairy industry apart from the conventional beef industry. These cattle are individually identified. These cattle have individual breeding records. Oftentimes, they're tied to parentage that have genomic data. So the idea is that these cattle are far more traceable as a whole than most all of the cattle in the conventional beef industry, and that is certainly marketable and valuable, not only domestically but in international markets, which sets them up very well for branded programs all across the globe. We've published most of our things. If you just search my last name on Google or Google Scholar, you'll find our publications pop up. We have a total of 6 of them now in this space. These are just 2 examples of that, including a review, which is what most of this was built off of, so you can easily and readily access those. And I got a lot of time for questions, which is good. Yeah.
Thank you for the fantastic
You're welcome.
presentation. Do you see the liver abscesses the same with Angus Holstein as well as Wagyu Holstein, or does it change with breeds?
Yeah, it's a good question, so I'll repeat it for those that couldn't hear it. Does the liver abscess problem change with breeds? No. In general, I would say no, it does not. It's more related to feeding and production practices at the feedlot level, potentially also the calf ranch level. So there's a lot of discussion about overall calf health, managing calves in that nursery or calf ranch stage with colostrum and other products that boost the immunity and maintain health. But in general, breed type, no. Now pause there for a second and tell you that in some cases, the Wagyu crosses are fed some 450 or 500 or more days. In that case, then yes, in general, there is a higher proportion of liver abscesses, but I'm not going to say that that's breed specific. I'm going to say that that's because they have been fed so incredibly long, right? And we increase the incidence in general of liver abscesses as we increase days on feed. So I'm going to steer away from saying yes on the breed discussion because I haven't seen any evidence of there being a breed-specific link to liver abscesses. It's probably more production centered or based. Yeah. Yes.
I'm a UW grad student. Thank you so much for your talk.
You bet.
We really have been talking about beef as a way to breed out low genetic value cows in dairies.
Yep.
And do you think that that's going to end up affecting the dairy type, and how can we do that? Because if we're breeding our low value cows with
Yep.
these Angus, are we producing a low value product?
Well, you're producing a very high valued product in terms of the beef calf, right?
Yeah.
In terms of what it's doing on the dairy side of the equation, I really don't know. You know, is that causing you to not cull that cow because she's worth so much in calf? I really can't answer that question. However, I would say that if the trends continue and the value of these calves continue to increase, I think it puts more and more pressure on the dairymen to make considerations about producing beef, you know, into the future. And if that maybe takes away from some of the more traditionally selected milk traits, then yeah, it could influence that. I'm not going to say that this is happening widespread, but there have been plenty of discussions about dairymen breeding cows to complementary beef bulls and even changing the cow base to better fit the beef business, like downsizing cows or eliminating the really large-framed Holstein cows in particular out of their business. So I certainly think it's coming more into the conversation. I don't know, candidly, how it affects milk production.
Yeah,
Follow
I
up?
guess, like, I think you misunderstood my
Probably.
question, but you gave me a very
Yeah.
interesting answer. What I mean is, how do we assess dairy genetics to complement and make these less dairy type cows?
Oh, yeah. I think you could easily select dairy cows to replace these low phenotyped offspring. One of the things that we're working on, right, is to better understand the phenotype of the offspring in the packing plant so that we can send signals back upstream to start selecting at least beef bulls for better phenotypes. That same data could be used to improve the phenotype of the dairy cows. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Again, I don't know if that perfectly answers your question, but it's my best shot as a meat guy at least. So any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Oh, yes, in the concluding statements, we can back up to that, show everybody what you're talking about. Yeah, so it's not except jerseys. Actually, this is a very positive thing for jerseys in the sense that we're really overcoming large obstacles for environmental sustainability by breeding jerseys to beef bulls. And this goes back to just adding, in an extreme way, value to Jersey bull calves. Yeah, for better or for worse, at least the Jersey bull calves have some value in this sense. So there's many of stories, right, where the Jersey bull calves didn't have any value in the marketplace, so they were sold at sale barns or given away or maybe even euthanized. So this is a bullet point that says, hey, if they're crossbreds, they have significant value in the market. So instead of losing that calf, we're taking that calf and putting that into production for beef purposes. So the amount of value added to a Jersey bull calf is far more than the value that was added originally to the Holstein. That's the point, yeah. Yes, sir. You're going to try to get me in trouble here big time. I'm going to give you a very academic answer here. So I'm not going to advocate for breeds. Although there are some breeds on average that provide more complementarity to the Jersey and the Holstein cows. So in general, breeds that have more muscling and combine that with a moderate frame score, or can provide that with a moderate frame score and impart marbling. So, you know, there are breeds that do that very well. Angus is the most prolific breed utilized in this scenario, predominantly because we want black cattle in the marketplace. Okay, so that is the main reason, and many people are pursuing high levels of marbling still in the product for economic reasons. However, there are equal opportunity with a non-black animal, such as a Charolais, such as a Limousin, right? Particularly in markets where heat stress is a huge issue, like in the extreme Southwest, like in Southern California, where those animals perform much better. As a breed, I would suggest that, you know, Charolais offers a tremendous amount of terminal aspect to all cattle, including these dairy cattle. But it really comes back to the individual bull, okay? Regardless if that bull is an Angus, a Charolais, a Limousin, you name the bull or the breed, those individual bulls are the ones that provide the genetic merit that we need in this cross-mating scenario. So we really should stop talking about quote-unquote breeds and probably talk more about individual bulls and how they perform, because each breed contains the right bull. The Angus breed contains the right bull, the Charolais breed, the Limousin breed, the Simmental breed, all contain probably the right bull or subset of bulls, and applying just a breed in general to this is really the wrong answer to what we're doing. I would even suggest, and I could really get chased out of the room for saying this, but perhaps the best bull is a composite, right? The idea that we're taking the best of multiple breeds, combining those into a single bull, so a Simmental Angus cross, right? A Charolais Angus cross, whatever that might be, a Limousin Angus cross. There are names for these types of cattle, right? And they're being used in this scenario to provide the best of both worlds. The beauty of it is one of the main advantages of using a purebred sire in a beef mating scenario is to create heterosis, right? So we take an Angus and we breed it to a Charolais. Because they're so far apart, genetically speaking, we get all of this synergy. And that's traditionally why we've used a lot of purebred bulls in the beef industry. But now, because Holstein and Jersey are so much different from all beef cattle, it really doesn't matter which breed we use. Even if it's a crossbred, we still get that heterozygosity. So we still get that +1 effect. So it's really a neat thing in what we have here. So I will tell you that this beef on dairy concept has opened the eyes of our industry to issues that exist in the entire industry, not just the crossbred industry, right? So how genetics work, how liver abscesses work, all of these things have been kind of exaggerated in this model, which has really helped us to pursue improvement in many other areas as well, including genetics. So it's kind of a trap question because there's a handful of guys in here that sell a lot of genetics, but there's really no perfect answer. The right bull, whether that bull is an Angus or a Charolais or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Yep, follow up.
We do a lot of breeding of Angus and Holstein in California.
Yes.
I was wondering about the Jersey, but the reason I prefer the Angus is because there's more breeders in the United States. They made more improvements on their marbling and
Yep.
ribeyes and sort. And they got good breeders where a lot of these net breeding programs, so we get a lot of more gain, get more improvement faster with these Angus.
Angus is the biggest breed by quite some margin, right? You have a lot more options with Angus. You're correct in saying that Angus has made more improvement as a breed in the last 30 years than really any other breed, but probably because they had more room to improve. You know, I mean, so, and that's kind of a stab, but at the same time, you know, kudos to them for making all of that progress. I will tell you that single trait selection for marbling and ribeye area, though, has helped to put us in this dangerous situation of the narrow steer and the thick steer, even though ribeye area is the same. Okay, so that ribeye area topic has been created by single trait selecting for an individual muscle. And so we've seen ribeye area grow, and the rest of the carcass hasn't necessarily grown with it. And so that's created some of these issues over the decades. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What are the farmers doing wrong to get abscess?
The dairy farmers? Anybody. Oh, God. We're recording this session, right? Well, I would say that it's a holistic problem, right? In the sense that we need to manage these calves from day old all the way to the end to have better health outcomes, right? So anything we can do to improve the calf's health, which does start at time of birth, right? Getting colostrum to that calf early on, I think, only makes good sense. There's probably some building, I don't know, somebody, Jeff, maybe you could help me. Is there any colostrum day one research out there that you're aware of? Yeah, so providing colostrum, you know, early on provides positive benefit in all aspects. General health can be related to liver abscesses later on, so on and so forth. Yeah, for the dairymen, they want to get it off the farm quick. Right. Absolutely. 24 to 28 months should definitely be the target and the ultimate age of these animals. We don't want to get to 30 months. 30 months has a whole new can of worms in terms of regulatory requirements. Once they reach 30 months, they're susceptible to BSE testing, BSE screening, removal of specified risk materials. We don't even want to go there, really. So we've got to avoid that 30-month time frame for sure. In general, 24 months or less is where most of these calves fall. 16 to 20 months is a really good time frame. Ultimately, back to your original question, total quality management is lacking in our industry, okay? Some do it very, very well. Some are managing these from the time they hit the ground, getting colostrum to those calves, providing vaccination, providing supplemental mineral, everything, right, to these calves from the time of birth through that nursery stage. I'm calling it nursery, not calf ranch, trying to replace that terminology in our industry, yeah, right? So that's deliberate. And then transitioning those to the feedlot. I mean, maintaining that health all through that finishing period, through the growth period, all of the periods really, really matters. What are people doing wrong? They're being cheap, right? They're not managing the calves to optimal health. They're treating problems instead of preventing problems. That's how I would generalize it. And then when we get into the late feeding period, they're feeding them too hot, too aggressive. So the feedlot actually bears a lot of the responsibility here. They want to pass the buck on upstream quite a bit, but there's more and more evidence today that that last 100 to 120 days matters the most. But what happens prior to that also matters. I'm not trying to take that responsibility away, but you know, we see the liver abscess when it matters the most on the day of death, which means that latter half of the feeding or finishing period perhaps matters the most. I will tell you though, in the most recent research that we've done looking at average daily gain, so we weighed the animals when they got to the feedlot, we weighed the animals 120 days in, we weighed them at 200 days when they died. Cattle with the extreme liver abscesses on the tail end of that study gained less than 1.1 pound per day in the last 100 days. They should be gaining 4. So there is no doubt that when the liver abscess exists, especially in a severe condition, that it is depressing the entire performance of that animal. So it doesn't only matter at the packing plant that we throw the liver away or that we trim 100 pounds off. We've probably lost 200 to 300 pounds in performance on the animal. So it's hugely costly, hugely, hugely costly. And it's happening in 1 out of every 5, yeah. Who is feeding them? So that's what we would, yeah, that first stage of growth, right, is occurring in what we call a calf ranch or calf nursery period. Today, most of that is being done in a large setting, right? There are corporate calf nurseries that are out there. In some cases, they're doing it on the dairy farm, right? So that's a shared responsibility. Some are maintaining ownership on the dairy farm, mainly larger dairies, some smaller dairies, but mainly larger ones. But most of the calves, the vast majority of calves, are going to a more corporate level calf nursery where they have 50,000 or 75,000 or 100,000 on one premise. And most of the time they're feeding them to 400 or 500 pounds before they're trading them. Some of them are maintaining ownership into the next stage, which means they're taking them from 500 pounds in a grower situation to about 800 or 900 pounds, and then they're transitioning them into the feeding yard. A lot of them today are going straight into the feed yard at 500, 600 pounds because of the market. The market is pulling them through faster. But there are multiple stages and ways of managing that. Who is doing it? It's a variety of entity doing that. I would say that there's plenty of incentive to do it yourself if you're a dairy farmer. It's just like anything else. It requires a facility, it requires a system, it requires employees, it requires a lot of overhead. So oftentimes, particularly if they're $700, why would you keep them a day longer than you have to, right? But in a time where maybe they go back to 300 or 250, there's a lot of opportunity to value add keeping them yourself. But it requires lots and lots of capital investment to do that. Yes, way in the back. I'm the wrong guy to ask for the right answer to that question. Although I would acknowledge, that the cow is the most important to you, not only on the day that she has her first calf, but the next calf and the next calf, or should I say the next lactation and the next lactation. Birth weight obviously matters, particularly on those first lactation heifers. Birth weight's pretty heritable, so you should be able to select bulls that don't harm your cows. But remember that the cow is half the equation. So you may have good numbers on the bull, but not so good information on the cow, and those two things together could go in the wrong direction. So it's not always the genetics or bull provider's fault. However, I would say that research has shown that there's a tremendous amount of inaccuracy in what bulls are being bred to what cows. And that has nothing to do with the entity putting the semen into the straw. That has everything to do with the technician on the farm, right? So, or the vet or whomever is doing that. So that's something to be looked at, perhaps. A lot of after-the-fact genetic verification has shown that cows aren't necessarily bred to the bulls they were supposed to be bred to, like at a very high rate, like at 35+%. So just pay attention to that. I would say that a lot of the opportunity in improvement in all aspects of what we're talking about has everything to do with the AI tech. And I'm not talking about getting the cow pregnant necessarily, but that AI tech making a conscious decision to breed a cow to one of 3 bulls, if that's what they're breeding to that day, right? So that person could make an assessment of size, phenotype, and choose from just 2 bulls or 3 bulls within their arsenal to make a better decision for that cow. So, and then also accurately using the right straw of semen in that process. So, follow up? Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up. I agree with all of that. We actually breed ourselves, so
Yeah.
it's not a huge problem on our farm. But would you recommend, if it was you, to actually just breed to the smaller bulls or the smaller breeds and then raise them up a little bit for 30 days so that I can sell them as babies, as opposed to picking larger breeds with larger birth weights?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's an option to do that. I think you have to do what's safe for the heifer, right, in choosing a low birth weight animal. Going for the gusto in round 1, unfortunately, doesn't work for anybody. Whether you're a Jersey producer, a Holstein producer, an Angus producer, we just have to understand that in production management, we use smaller bulls on heifer calves. Research has shown, however, those Jerseys can handle really big calves, particularly in 2nd and 3rd gestation. So I think once you're past that initial pregnancy, then you can probably do just about whatever you want. And then in that case, go bigger. Go big or go home there. I think this gentleman's tried to ask a question. Yeah.
You keep saying liver abscess, liver abscess.
Yeah.
Is there no way to look at that liver and that abscess to say some fashionable way when it really occurred?
Yes, there.
Or something to say, okay, where's the liver abscess?
So our most recent research shows that we can tell in a blood test whether they're going to have a liver abscess or not. So for research purposes, that's great. For practical purposes, I don't know what it helps, right? I mean, we've got to bleed the animal to determine whether it has a liver abscess, but even then at that point, what do we do with it? It's not like we can treat it, to change that. Ultrasound, again, a very invasive, expensive because of the technician, way to determine if there's a liver abscess. Ultrasound is about 60% effective at saying there is a liver abscess there or not, because they can see about 60% of the liver. That's about what it's limited to. So predicting whether an animal has one or not is not a real opportunity today. We're looking for genetic links to see if there's any genetic predisposition to liver abscess. probably not going to find that, just to be candid with you, because it's like a needle in the haystack and it requires thousands of thousands to find any predisposition to something like that. However, there are eating behaviors that make animals more predisposed. An animal that overeats is predisposed. An animal that eats 2 really large meals and then 8 really small ones, or 15 really small ones all day long. Any of that sporadic eating behavior has been demonstrated to be tied to liver abscess condition in fed cattle. I think if you talk to a dairyman, and I've heard this before, I actually heard this in South Dakota last time I was there, that evidently, dairy cows, in particular Holstein cows, are notorious for being overeaters, right? Some will absolutely gorge and overeat, others will not. Is there a genetic link to that? Perhaps. If there is, we'd like to find that. But again, it's probably a needle in the haystack looking for that. One of the coolest things, for lack of better words, we've found is the association between liver size and liver abscess. So there's no doubt that abscess livers are larger than non-abscess livers on average. So our question is do those cattle genetically have a larger liver? Or did they grow a larger liver as a result of eating more? So it's kind of like chicken or egg. Like, did one exist before the other? We don't really know. The size of the liver at birth, at least, should be dictated by genetics. So if there's a strong enough association with liver size and genetics, then maybe we'll find that. But even then, there's not a definite relationship between liver size and liver abscess. It's just on average, they're larger, which a veterinarian in the room will probably tell you, yeah, because it has an abscess and it's inflamed. Yeah, that's part of the reason too. So a lot of these things are somewhat confounded, or definitely are confounded. Yeah, it's 10 after, so I don't know if there's another session in
I was
here
going to say,
or
yeah,
not.
I'll cut you off now, but
Perfect.
maybe if you have time for questions, you could
Yeah,
go
well,
around,
I
but-
don't. I've got to go to the
Okay.
airport.
Okay,
My flight's in an
so-
hour and 20 minutes.
Thank
so.
you, everyone, for the
Anyway,
attentive.
thank you, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. There should also be evaluation forms somewhere that you can drop in the back of the room as well to let us know how you liked it. So, thank you.